The idea of wearing something sacred is universal and timeless. In the early days of Christianity, it might have been wax from the candles burning in the front of the saints' tombs. And as recently as when the Ayatollah Khomeini died in Iran, people flooded his funeral bier and started tearing off bits and pieces of him to the extent where authorities had to fly the body off in a helicopter because it was being dismembered. It's a universal and weird idea, but people want a piece, literally, of somebody that they greatly revere in hopes that maybe that person's characteristics will pass on to you. I was in Lima, Peru in the late 70s, and I walked into an antique store and saw these beautiful little pendants, painted pendants on two sides. The painting was excellent. It was really well done. And I asked the antique dealer what they were, and she said, "Oh, those are Relicarios. They are 18th century, a small pendant, two-sided, usually in a metal bezel, and they were usually suspended from a cord or a chain." Of course, there was the inevitable bargaining that went on. We're in the range of $200, which was more than I really could spend at the time. So I bought them. And when I got home, after the buying trip, I started reading and to see what I could find out about what I came to call a genre of religious art and jewelry in Latin America. So it took me years before I realized that I was being had. No, they weren't 18th century. No, the bezels weren't silver. But it started me on a quest for 40 years of looking for pendants that fill this particular description. I just bought a few more last week. I must be out of my mind. For many years, I would go to the University of New Mexico Library, which has a pretty good Latin America department. This was a reprint done in the 80s, I think. It's 658 pages long. And how many times would the word relicario be mentioned in here? Maybe 1 or 2 times. The problem with them, for me as a researcher, is that there are no glossaries. There are often no tables of contents, no indices. And I scanned them, literally, with my eyeballs, looking for certain words. This is one about clothing and adornment, jewelry. He's talking about a guy named Don Ignacio de Allende, who was the Captain General, and he wore a jacket of blue cloth with a little collar and blah, blah, blah. A gentleman wears relics. The most famous Christian relic of all was the cross upon which Christ was crucified. And people immediately started taking bits and pieces of it and putting them in statues or pictures on the wall. One waggish historian said that if all of the pieces of the true cross were really pieces of the true cross. I mean, it was forests. It was also the pieces of the cloth that they had been wearing, bits of their sandals, and then, of course, corporeal remains, if we can use the term, fingernails, bones, teeth, toenails. And these were eventually placed in Relicarios. Nuns in convents had access to relics. They made these beautiful little compositions, usually paper with little apertures in which they would place actual relics. This one here, for example, is typical of a Spanish reliquary, and it has bits and pieces of actual bone and sometimes cloth of saints. And then the other side of this is a print, maybe a colored print later. The frame is a mixed metal, probably iron. And what I gradually learned was that this was originally a Spanish and Portuguese, and to some lesser extent, Italian custom of wearing relics of the saints. In Viceregal Peru, which is basically the South American continent minus Brazil, pre-Columbian people had the tradition of carving effigies made of alabaster, which in Peru is called piedra huamanga. These were typically of the animals, of people, sometimes of hands, feet, arms, legs, or an entire household. People used them as amulets for protecting their herds of alpacas and for protecting their households. And then you had the Europeans who had their amulet relics of the saints. And so in the Americas, you had this melding of those traditions. So the priests, they recognized that Native people had a lot of talent and encouraged local people to make Christian art for decorating the thousands of churches and chapels that they were building. When people came to the Americas, because they didn't have access to relics, Mexican silversmiths and artists started to make ones which I call kind of symbolic relicarios, because they were not the bits and pieces of the saints or their clothing or anything like that. Now they were prints, paintings, beautiful miniature paintings, or bas-relief sculptures in a wide variety of materials. The Catholic Church, starting from probably the medieval times, silversmiths or metalsmiths of some kind would make these little flat-topped boxes for carrying the consecrated host to people who were ill. In the early 1600s, as far as I can tell, and this was probably around Cusco, Peru, some of the relicario makers took this form and they put relicarios inside They used a pre-Columbian technique, which was, for them, which was a pasta. And this is a handmade, malleable mixture, usually of mashed potatoes, plaster, some kind of local glue, and who knows what else, as a surface for making bas-reliefs. Really interesting silversmithing with what I would consider pretty close to pre-Columbian symbols. And this is the reverse side. Again, made of pasta and heavily gilded and polychromed. And this seemed to last for only a very short time. These are quite difficult to find. All the Relicarios are very difficult to find. The travel was mostly associated with buying trips once or possibly twice a year because it was very expensive and a little iffy at times. I mean, I've been in hurricanes and earthquakes and all of that. I would buy things that I thought I could resell in the store, but also for my own personal interests. Talk to people and ask people about the Relicarios, ask in museums, look at paintings and prints to see what I could find in terms of information about what I was beginning to call a genre. As I was in markets or other antique shops, I kept asking, and the response was often pretty similar. It was, oh, I think I have some of those somewhere. And an antique dealer would pull out a drawer and root around and eventually come up with one. And it was not going to be the same. It was going to be maybe a print, maybe a bas-relief sculpture. But it's like a book. It tells me something. This is a beauty. This one is polychromed, which means painted ivory, in a beautiful Baroque frame. It's one piece carved on two sides that kind of complement each other. This is a wonderful, wonderful one from the Quito school, very typical bas-relief carving in ivory. Silver was very rare in Asia and very desirable. So Asia wanted to import silver and, to some extent, gold from the Americas. By the same token, the people who were making a lot of money off the mines, mainly Europeans, wanted to spend their money. Starting in the late 1500s, ships would take metals from the Americas and go to Manila and return with luxury goods. And a primary luxury good was ivory from African and Asian elephants. Aboard the returning galleons to the Americas were Chinese craftsmen who were not sailors. That's why there were a lot of really serious accidents. And in order to sail to the Americas, because they wanted to participate in this incredible wealth, these Chinese artisans had to cut their queues, their long hair, and they had to assume Spanish names. They were, in many cases, ivory carvers. They probably smuggled a lot of small bits of ivory aboard the galleons, and during that long, boring voyage, set about carving the ivory and then polychroming and gilding. They made Relicario images, bas-reliefs. So many of the ivory carvings that you see today that were found in Mexico or South America were actually made by Asian craftsmen, many of whom also immigrated to the Americas. Silver and gold heading toward Asia attracted pirates, many of them English, and really threatened the galleon trade, made it very, very difficult. Also, the growing movements for independence in the Americas in the late 1700s made it less possible, or less feasible, I should say, for the galleon trade to continue. So when craftsmen who made religious sculpture and relicarios could not obtain actual ivory, they resorted to a palm nut that grows primarily in Colombia and Ecuador, and it's called tagua. When it's carved, tagua is a beautiful kind of vanilla white inside, and then it hardens, and it's pretty indestructible. This is probably one of the best examples. You can see the patina and the design very well. This is a really strange little one, and I would say that this is probably from the 1800s sometime, and made either in Colombia or Ecuador. Both of those were part of the Kingdom of Quito. Further south in Bolivia, mining became a principal activity. Mining was very, very dangerous. It still is. The people who worked in those mines were in many cases conscripted people, natives from the Lake Titicaca area and the highland environs. They continued a tradition of making relicarios of the virgins that are very, very popular in that area, namely the Virgin of Copacabana. And they were incredible, incredible craftsmen. The most important school, I think, is Copacabana, which is a pre-Columbian shrine that was Christianized in the 1500s by missionaries, Dominicans first and then Augustinians. And the people who had formerly made souvenirs for pre-Columbian pilgrims began to make relicarios that reflected an image of what the Virgin of Copacabana. And the work was extremely fine and goes back at least 400 years. The image is pretty standard. It's a triangular gilded virgin holding the infant Jesus. One side is the sun and the other side is the moon. And those symbols may actually reflect pre-Columbian allegiance to the Inca god of the sun and the god of the moon, Coati, who were venerated on islands off the coast of Copacabana. The word Copacabana does not come from a Brazilian bar, but rather it's a Hispanicized version of a pre-Columbian goddess, Cota as far as I understand. These are miniature paintings that are extremely fine. They were done with a horse's eyelash or the hair from a boar's ear. I mean, all kinds of things like that. Probably the finest work that I have ever seen is this one, and it's by a painter who probably was working in the late 19th century, and I don't know how long he lived, but this particular one dates to 1907, and his name was Juan Gutierrez. I asked about him, and they said, oh yes, he was really, really a fine painter. This is a wonderful shaped shell. I guess it's an oyster shell. And a German traveler came along and saw this man's work and wanted to take him to Germany, to make him famous, I guess, I don't know. And the man's wife refused to leave Copacabana, so he continued to work there, and I'm not sure when he died, but I would imagine it was an early part of the 20th century. I believe this one is also by him. After 40 years of looking at as many as I could in my own collecting and in collections of other people and in museum collections, I have realized that a number of these, which are, I would say, late Baroque, early 19th century, have brown faces. This is very, very unusual. This one has it. This one certainly has it. Relicarios are a melding of traditions to the extent where some of the art forms that became popular in the Americas were no longer European, and they were no longer indigenous, but something new. This work is pretty close to being forgotten. Many art historians from Mexico and from Latin America are not aware of this work.